Hey guys, so we are on chapter 18.3 and 18.4 in your textbook. And if you're on my website, we're on chapter 10. And we'll be discussing the heart physiology and the development of the cardiovascular system today. So, heart physiology, let's start off with the cardiac conduction. So, basically, cardiac conduction describes the path of an action potential down your heart. And if you don't know what an action potential is, either go back to the muscular system or go to the nervous system because I describe it there. And the steps for the cardiac conduction, the places where it occurs, are the sinoatrial node, or SA node, the atrioventricular node, or the AV node, the atrioventricular bundle, or the bundle of His, and the Purkinje fibers. I'll explain them in this picture. So here's your sinoatrial node. It'll send an action potential down in these directions, where the arrows are. And that action potential allows your atria to contract. And then after that, there's your atrioventricular node right here. It kind of delays it so that your atria can contract before your ventricles contract. And your atrioventricular node will send the action potential down this way in your bundle of His, and it's made up of a left bundle branch and a right bundle branch. And it'll go to the Purkinje fibers right here. And these allow your heart to contract, your ventricle to contract. Moving on, we're going to talk about the electrocardiogram, which is also known as the ECG or EKG. I hear it more commonly called the EKG, but we're going to call it the ECG for the heck of it. So it's a graph that shows the electrical activity of the heart. It shows time versus electrical activity in millivolts, I believe, or if it's X versus Y, which I think it is. Anyway, so they actually show a specific pattern, and the pattern is represented by letters P, Q, R, S, T. Let's take a look at this picture. So here's your electrocardiogram. I like this picture, by the way, because it shows how your cardiac cycle and your electrocardiogram relate, but we'll talk about the cardiac cycle next. Anyway, so here is your electrocardiogram. So P is here. So a depolarization occurs at P, and this is the depolarization in your atria. And then here is QRS, and that's a big peak because it's depolarization in your ventricles. And your ventricles are huge. They make up the majority of your heart. So QRS will have a huge depolarization spike. And then after that, there's T right here, which is the repolarization of the I just had a mind fart, but it's the repolarization of the ventricles. And you might be wondering, where's the repolarization of your atria? Well, it's hidden by this QRS because the QRS is so huge since it's the ventricles. Anyway, moving on. The cardiac cycle. So it describes the systolic or contractile and diastolic or relaxing events of the heart. So it's made up of isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. And I know what you're thinking. What is that? I'll explain it once we get to that picture below. And then after that, step 2 is ventricular filling. And then step 3 is ventricular systole. So here's this picture. It starts off with step 1 being ventricular filling, but I'm going to start off with step 1 being isovolumetric relaxation. So isovolumetric relaxation is basically your ventricles are relaxed, and the volume of blood within each ventricle is the same. That's what isovolumetric is. And then after that, your diastolic period, so ventricular filling, is here. So it says early diastole, but I call it rapid filling, and then it says mid to late diastole. I just call it diastasis. But anyway, so early diastole or rapid filling happens when your ventricles are just starting to fill up with blood, and it's going to fill up fast in rapid filling or early diastole. And then after that, to mid to late diastole or diastasis, it's going to fill up a little more slowly because, as you can see, it's considerably full here. And then there's atrial contraction, which is kind of self-explanatory. The atria will contract, allowing the blood to go into the ventricles. And then what will happen is it'll go into the systolic period or contracting period. So first there'll be isovolumetric contraction, and so your your ventricles will contract, but it'll only contract so that your valves will close, your atrioventricular valves. And it's called isovolumetric because the volume of blood in these in the ventricles is the same with the contraction. And then after that, there's ventricular ejection, which is basically your ventricles contract again so that the blood will push up against the semilunar valves and go into your great vessels. So the volume at the end of ventricular ejection, so the volume at basically isovolumetric rejection, relaxation, is called the end systolic volume, and the volume at the end of atrial contraction, or the volume here pretty much, is called the end diastolic value, and those are shown by acronyms ESV and EDV. Anyway, moving on. So the cardiac output is stroke volume times heartbeat, and this will show the amount of volume pumped in the ventricles per minute, because stroke volume is the amount of volume pumped by the ventricles per each contraction. So cardiac output, as I said before, is the amount of ventricular, or the volume pumped by the ventricles per each minute. And frankly, I don't know how the units divide out with this equation, but that is the equation for cardiac output, though. And cardiac output varies depending on the condition of the person. So if the person exercised a lot recently, then his heartbeat's going to be really high, and that will make your cardiac output really high. And that goes to my next little bullet there. So a change in stroke volume or a change in heartbeat will ultimately change the cardiac output. So higher stroke volume means higher cardiac output. Higher heartbeat means higher cardiac output. Lower stroke volume means lower cardiac output, or lower heartbeat means lower cardiac output. And stroke volume depends on three things: preload, contractility, and afterload. And your heartbeat is regulated by the autonomic nervous system. So in your nervous system, we haven't gone over this yet, but your nervous system is made up of two parts: your central and peripheral. Central is the main parts, your brain and your spine. The peripheral is basically the nerves that jut out of them. And then, so in your peripheral nervous system, there's the somatic nervous system, which controls your voluntary movements, and the autonomic nervous system, which controls your involuntary movements. And your autonomic nervous system can be divided into two parts: your somatic nervous system and your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic nervous system is basically the person that fills you up with adrenaline. And your parasympathetic nervous system is the nervous system that says, "Hey, relax, man." So as you can guess, the sympathetic nervous system will increase your heart rate, and the parasympathetic nervous system will decrease it. So chemicals also affect your heartbeat, and so do other factors like gender and age. So if you didn't understand what preload, contractility, and afterload is, I'm explaining it now. So preload is basically the amount of stretch that your heart gets when your ventricles are being filled. So your ventricles are going to fill up with blood, and they're going to stretch a little bit, and the amount of stretch is called preload. Contractility is the amount they contract, the amount of force that they contract with, and that actually can be that can depend on if there's like hormones involved in stuff. It can change depending on the hormones and stuff. And then after that, there's afterload. And afterload is the amount of force needed to push open that valve. And then there's heart rate, which I talked about already. So moving on. The developmental aspects of the cardiovascular system. So let's start off with how it forms. Your heart has several stages of formation, and I'm just going to discuss that in the picture below. And arteries go through something called angiogenesis, which is basically blood vessel formation through an existing blood vessel. But veins have to go through something called vasculogenesis, and then they have to go through angiogenesis. Vasculogenesis is basically blood vessel formation on their own. They don't form on another vessel. They form on their own. And then once they're formed, angiogenesis can occur. I'll explain this in the picture. So as you can see, for your heart starts out as little heart fields in the embryo, and then it'll turn into like this tube thing. It'll twist, and once it twists, you can see the familiar heart shape now. And what's going to happen is your atrium and your ventricle will form. But both of your atria and your but will form, but there will be only be one ventricle. And then trabeculation occurs, which is basically that the forming of the trabeculi carnii, which I talked about in last episode. Those ridges right here, and that will actually make your differentiate your left ventricle and your right ventricle. And then after that, it'll form into this right here, and to birth, it'll look like that. So when I was talking about angiogenesis, when your heart forms, it already has the arteries formed here. There's your aortic arch right here, and there's the pulmonary artery that's already been formed. So what's going to happen is angiogenesis occurs. So all the rest of the blood vessels, or blood vein, not blood veins, the rest of the arteries will form off of these arteries right here, and that's angiogenesis. But veins, they first have to form on their own before they can actually have other smaller veins branch off of them. So let's talk about how aging affects the heart. The heart becomes less efficient with age. So what happens is cardiac output decreases because your heart rate decreases as you age. And heart valves thicken by something called fibrosis, which is basically like a thickening of connective tissue, or calcification, which is calcium depositing. And that will make it harder for your heart to pump blood through the valve, and that makes your heart less efficient. And as you age, your chance for atherosclerosis also increases. And if you do get atherosclerosis, you're decreasing the efficiency of your heart. So atherosclerosis is basically the buildup of plaque which is basically like fat deposits in your blood vessels, and that'll create like a little clot, and that's bad. So before we go, I want to mention congenital heart diseases. So they're basically heart defects, and they are main causes of birth defect related death. That's all I really want to talk about them or explain. But let's take a look at this picture. So here's a normal heart, and blood flows normally. But if you have a congenital heart disease or heart defect, that is called a ventricular septal defect, then what's going to happen is, your septum has a hole in it. So that's a specific congenital heart defect. And this can happen in babies, and that's the number one cause of baby death due to birth defects. Anyway, we're done, so thanks for watching. Bye.